Alright everyone, welcome back to the Neverglades. In this 8th and final entry in the Neverglades mysteries, we rejoin Hannigan and Marconi as they investigate further into the origins of the strange association called Capra. But, in the middle of their investigation, as things usually do in the Glades, things go wrong. I hope you all enjoy. 2 weeks after our great escape from the facility, Marconi and I were investigating Capra at the station when the whole fucking world fell apart. We dug into the organization as far as we could go, and our efforts had turned up zilch. Nothing to incriminate them, at any rate. For all intents and purposes, the Climate Association for the Pacific Regional Area was a government agency founded in 1985 that regulated water levels and maintained our public parks and forests. That was it. There was nothing anywhere to indicate they were tearing giant holes in the universe to let in all sorts of beasties. "Take a look at this," Marconi said, passing me a newspaper clipping. It was a blurry photograph of a bunch of scientists gathered outside the front gates of Capra headquarters. At the front of the pack was a young Valentina Koppel. Her face was smooth and wrinkle-free, her eyes bright behind her glasses. "I had to dig this one out of the archives," Marconi said. "For some reason, Uncle Sam's climate brigade coming to town didn't exactly make headlines." "That's her, isn't it?" "Yeah," I replied. "I wonder if..." But a loud, sudden rumble cut me off. A tremor shook the station and almost knocked the two of us off our feet. I grabbed the corner of my desk as a filing cabinet toppled over and went sliding across the room. My computer monitor flipped backwards and shattered. Everything had gone slanted, turning the floor of my office into a carnival slide. Marconi reached out and grabbed my arm to keep from slipping. "Earthquake?" I shouted over the rumble. "No shit," she shouted back. "I've never seen one this bad." We clutched the desk and stayed low as we waited for the quaking to stop. It took about 5 minutes for the tremors to subside completely. Marconi and I shared an uneasy look. The floor was tilted at an awkward angle, so we had to clamber upward to reach the door and climb into the main lobby. The station was in a shambles. There was an enormous crack running through the floor, with desks and chairs sticking up from inside. Dust floated through the air and people were stumbling through the haze, coughing loudly. I heard a choked gasp of pain from up front and hurried towards the source of the noise. Abigail Shannon was lying on the ground, her leg pinned by a fallen rafter. There was a blood-soaked patch on the shin of her pants and a tiny protrusion that could have been a broken bone. Nico Sanchez ran past me and I grabbed him by the arm. "Get that thing off her and splint her leg," I ordered. "I'm going to see if anyone else is injured." His face was pale, but Sanchez nodded and knelt down to lift the piece of tangled metal. I looked around and waved a hand through the air to try and clear the dust. I spotted a few people on the floor and stumbled towards them, but they weren't hurt, only shaken, so I helped them to their feet and continued making the rounds. Most of them were okay. Only Abigail suffered a severe injury, and even that wasn't life-threatening. I went back and helped Sanchez load her onto a makeshift stretcher. The phone lines were down along with our cell phones, so we couldn't call for an ambulance. Sanchez and I looked at each other, then picked up the stretcher and pushed through the front door of the station. We had a few bigger cruisers specifically designed to carry injured passengers. One of those would have to do. Abigail hissed in pain as we carried her outside. We were 10 steps into the parking lot when Sanchez stopped dead. I almost tripped and spilled Abigail onto the pavement. "What the fuck?" I shouted, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were turned to the sky. The color had utterly drained from his face. I looked up, and I understood. There was an enormous tear in the sky, a jagged gash across the clouds that cut off the bottom half of the sun. The edges of the gash glowed a faint purple. Inside was nothing but void. I stared into the emptiness and saw something large and dark stirring in its depths. A familiar icy dread rushed through my entire body. "Shit," Marconi breathed. She had joined us in the parking lot, and she wasn't staring at the rip in the sky. I looked downward and drew in a sharp intake of breath. The Neverglades had turned into a disaster zone. The streets had heaved upwards like a ripple in water and frozen in lurching, lumpy formations. Trees had fallen on cars and power lines. Houses had collapsed on themselves. Now that I was focused on the world below the rift, I could hear the distant blare of car alarms and people shouting for help. My stomach churned. "Ruth," I uttered. At the same second, Marconi said, "Janine." I got my shit together long enough to help Sanchez load Abigail into the back of the emergency cruiser. Then I turned to Marconi and yanked the inspector's calling card out of my pocket. "I'm going to find my family," I said, handing her the card. "I'm sure the inspector already knows what's going on, but if you don't run into him, light that card on fire and he'll come running. I have a feeling we're going to need him soon enough." Marconi took the card and stared at it for a moment. "Be careful, Hannigan," she said. "This might not be the only quake we get today. If it's even half as bad as the last one." "I'll be fine," I said. "I can take care of myself. Just make sure Janine is okay." She nodded, and we both set off to our separate cruisers. Sanchez had already left with the wounded Abigail, so I revved the engine and rolled out of the parking lot. On my right, Marconi's car took a sharp turn and headed down the road towards her house. I pulled into the street and immediately found myself faced with a bump 2 feet high. The road beyond it didn't look much better. I planted my foot on the gas and flew over the first bump, then the next, my body rattling back and forth inside the vehicle. It was going to be a shaky ride. There was a ton of debris blocking the road, and I had to swerve dangerously to avoid it. At one point, I came to a screeching halt when the pavement in front of me suddenly dropped away into a narrow chasm that hadn't been there a day before. I spun the wheel and turned around, searching for a detour. All the while, I had to keep my eyes low, since looking up at the rift made a familiar throbbing pulse behind my eyelids. I wasn't going to be any help to anyone with a splitting migraine. So I focused on the here and now, on Pacific Glade, my town in shambles. People were emerging from their battered houses, some clutching wounded limbs, others staring in fear up at the void. The ground let out another ominous rumble as something dark and unknowable shifted in all that nothing. Time is running out, I thought. My heart sank when I turned onto my street and caught the first glimpse of my house, or what was left of it. The entire second floor had collapsed in on itself, leaving a mess of broken rafters and chunks of roofing. There was a jagged gash in our front lawn where the ground had split apart. I urged the car to go faster. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw a solitary figure standing in the front yard. Ruth. Her deep blue summer dress whipped around her in the wind. I brought the car to a hasty halt and leaped out of the front seat. Ruth rushed towards me at once, throwing her arms around me. There was a cut on her cheek, but it was barely more than a sliver, and otherwise she seemed to be unhurt. "You're safe," she gasped. "Oh, thank God you're safe." "What about the boys?" I asked, letting go reluctantly. "Are they okay?" Ruth hesitated. Her eyes didn't give away what she was thinking, but the longer the silence went on, the deeper my stomach dropped. Finally, she turned and began walking towards the front steps. She looked back to make sure I was following. "Just come inside, honey," was all she said. I climbed the steps after her, feeling a little numb. The inside of our house was just as destroyed as the outside. The refrigerator had toppled over and unleashed a splatter of broken eggs and soupy leftovers. Our kitchen counter had been cleaved straight down the middle. In the living room, the TV lay in a pile of splintered glass. Every picture frame had fallen from the walls and shattered. Stephen was standing by the couch, apparently unharmed, and the sight of him sent such a surge of relief through me that I almost didn't notice Rory. My younger son was laid out on the cushions, his messy hair strewn with pebbly bits of rubble. One hand rested on his chest. The other dangled limply over the edge of the couch. "He's sleeping," I told myself frantically. "He's just sleeping." But when I reached down to touch Rory's hand, I saw the dent in his forehead, a bloody wound of matted hair and brain matter. His skin was cold. I gripped his hand and felt a heaving sensation in my stomach. Someone was sobbing, and it took a second to realize it was me. "We were just playing video games in my room," Stephen said, like he was in a daze. "I went downstairs to grab a snack. If I'd waited an extra minute or two, I could have... He couldn't bring himself to finish. His fingers clutched at the arm of the couch, knuckles white. I couldn't see anymore. My eyes were too blurred with tears. I tried to wipe them away, but they kept spilling, and why shouldn't they? My son was gone. Just a few weeks ago, he'd been sitting on that same couch reading a comic book way past his bedtime. I remembered how world-weary he'd looked then. Now he didn't look weary at all, just small. Footsteps crunched across the rubble. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it was Ruth. She drew close and cupped my face in her hands. "Mark," she said. "Mark, look at me." I turned my teary eyes to her. The wind from the broken windows caught her hair and sent dust billowing around us. Ruth looked into my eyes, and I saw myself reflected in that hardened hazel. Her cheeks were dry, barring the blood from that sliver of a cut. My wife wasn't crying. I had no idea how she managed to hold in so much pain. "There's nothing we can do for Rory," she said gently. "There are others who need help right now. Friends, family, neighbors. The earthquake was a big one and people are bound to be hurt." When I said nothing, she leaned forward and placed her forehead against mine. "We'll mourn later," she whispered. "But for now we have to help where we can." I clutched at her arm. "How?" I breathed. "How can you be so calm when he's..." I couldn't finish the thought. Another sob escaped my throat. Ruth lifted her head from mine, then looked to Stephen. Our son was staring down at his brother with a profound hollowness in his eyes. One of his hands rested on the couch cushion, inches from Rory's blood-matted hair. "When my father died," Ruth said, "I realized that death doesn't pull punches. It can come out of nowhere and knock you clean off your feet, and it's so easy to stay knocked down. To give in to loss and anguish, getting up again is the hardest thing in the world." She turned back to face me. "I love our son," she said, and her voice hitched. "God, Mark, I love him so much. And I'm absolutely devastated that he's gone. But this isn't the time to stay knocked down. There are people out there who need me more than Rory does. There are other families with kids who can be saved, so I'm going to do whatever I can to save them. I'm not letting death get the last word today." She left me standing in our blasted living room and retreated to the side hallway. When she returned, she was holding the first aid kit we always kept stashed in the hall closet. Stephen watched her silently as she crossed the room and planted a dry kiss on my lips. I kissed her back and was deeply sorry when she backed away. "I saw what's in the sky," she said. "I know this is the kind of thing you and the inspector handle, so I'll leave you to do what you have to do." She reached out and grasped my hand. "But Mark, please stay safe." "I will," I said. That was the last thing I ever said to my wife, and it was a bald-faced lie. How shitty is that? But it was a lie we'd built our lives around from the beginning. This wasn't a safe world, not even close. If this job had taught us anything, it's that tomorrow was a gift, not a guarantee. So in this crazy, dangerous world, why wouldn't I want to come home to a safe house, a safe family, and nestle safely into bed with the woman I loved? It may have been a lie, but at least it had been a beautiful one. I met Marconi outside the Hanging Rock 20 minutes later. The inspector trailed behind her, cigar wisping into the sky in clouds of light blue smoke. I don't think I'd ever seen him so pale, not even when we were working the Wendigo case. His eyes seemed glued to the massive rip above us. It was early, but even at this time of day, the Hanging Rock should have been bustling with mid-afternoon customers, work-weary employees having a drink or two away from their jobs. Not anymore. The rock had caved in on itself, leaving 2 sloping halves and a whole ton of splintered rubble. If anyone was left inside, they'd probably been crushed by the debris. Rory's bashed-in forehead floated behind my eyelids. I blinked it away furiously. "How's Janine?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You'll never believe it," Marconi replied. "When the shaking started, she got knocked off her feet and sprained her wrist, breaking her fall. That's it. The house didn't even get too damaged except for a few broken plates. We were lucky." "Lucky," I repeated. "Yeah." I knew it was coming, and I should have been ready, but it still hurt when Marconi said it. "How about you? Is your family okay?" I swallowed a painful lump and tried to clear my throat. I looked off towards the wreckage of the rock, at the mounds of wood and stone, and tried to remember what Ruth had said. "I'm not letting death get the last word today. Ruth and Stephen are fine," I said quietly. Rory didn't make it." It took Marconi a moment. "Oh," she said. "Oh, Jesus, your son. Christ, Mark, are you saying Rory—" "He's dead," the inspector said curtly. The words stabbed into me like shards of glass, and I recoiled. God, what a time for the inspector to remind me he wasn't human. "He's dead, and he won't be the only one," the inspector went on. "The earthquake is bound to have taken a few others. The rift will take the rest." He stared at us with those cold purple eyes, his cigar tip burning. "This is no time to be delicate, officers. We're not talking about a few dead bodies here. We're not even talking about genocide. This is extinction." He lifted his hand and stuck one thin finger into the sky. We looked up into the void, and I felt a twinge of pain bloom in my temple. The void wasn't empty. That looming shadow from before was there, and it was bigger now, its shape vast and dark and unmistakable. It opened its jaws and let out a low moan that sent another tremble through the ground. Is that a whale?" Marconi said. "A fucking space whale?" "It's the Leviathan," the inspector said in a hollow voice. "The Star Eater. The all-consuming beast. It only exists to devour. It doesn't care that your world is covered with specks of life. It doesn't care about the Rorys or the Janines. It just plows through the cosmos and swallows worlds whole. If it gets through that rift, everything is over. Everything." I saw that thing before, I said. In the purple world, how did it cross the rift? It didn't, the inspector said darkly. The Leviathan can't cross universes on its own, which means it had outside help. I cast a sharp look at Marconi. You don't think, I said. She nodded. Capra. I can't fathom why any humans would be so colossally stupid as to welcome in the Leviathan, the inspector said. But I agree with you both. I have a feeling our friends at the facility are responsible for this mess. Something in the wind turned. The sadness inside me shifted, grew hot and roiling. And suddenly I realized I was angry. Before I had been directionless. I couldn't blame Rory's death on an earthquake or a falling rafter or even a monster from outer space, but I could blame an arrogant scientist who'd already proven that she saw human beings as expendable. I could blame Valentina Koppel. I turned abruptly and walked to my cruiser. The ruins of Hanging Rock cast a long shadow over me. As I pulled open the driver's door, I ran a hand along the holster on my hip. My thumb brushed the dented metal handle of my pistol. Hannigan? Marconi said. There was a touch of worry in her voice. Come on, I replied, sounding calmer than I felt. We've got a gate to crash. I hope you've all enjoyed the first entry in the final Neverglades mystery, Devour. I'll be back in a few days with the conclusion to the series. It's been a fun ride, and I hope everyone enjoyed coming along with me. As per usual, I'll provide links to the original post, the music, and the artwork that I've used in the description down below. I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.